4 sailboats. Number 1, deep in the wilds of Minnesota, in the boundary waters on the edge of Canada, there's no way to get around except by canoe, or if you learn to ride a moose, you can ride a moose, but otherwise it's just canoes. And in between every lake, there's a portage trail. You have to carry your canoe and all your gear on your back. Last week we mentioned part of this adventure that I was on for a summer. We had a little kid who would sneak in the toilet paper and the Kool-Aid, and he'd start a little black market for all the little stuff, and he'd get his brownies. Well, we had another week that he wasn't on. 5 amazing teenagers. 5 great kids, hardworking, interested. They were good outdoorsmen. They were fun. They're the kind of kids that you kind of, that's what makes you want to work with teenagers. So we had these 5 great kids, and we had one other young man. Words really can't describe. He was lazy. He was impolite. He was helpless. He was obnoxious. Some of you have dealt with teenagers like this. Some of you have lived with teenagers like this. In canoeing, there is a term called lily dipping. And it is where you stick your paddle in the water, and then you just kind of... This boy was a big boy, big old boy. And he would sit in that canoe, and he'd move all day long, nothing. And so the other kids were getting frustrated. He wouldn't wash the dishes and breakfast. He wouldn't carry the extra tent, and he was the biggest kid there. It was getting tense between all the kids. So we needed a project to bond them and tie them together. So one morning, my partner, Dan, I was the foreman, and I knew a good bit about building trails, and I'd worked with teenagers, but Dan knew way more about outdoorsmanship and the Forest Service, Boy Scout stuff. So he really had the idea about how to tie these kids together. We'd been paddling for a few hours. We stopped at the portage for that mid-morning snack, and whenever we would take a pemmican bar and you'd put some peanut butter and some jelly, we had a squeezed jelly thing, and with like 8 of us, one big squeezed jelly thing never gets empty, and you don't have refrigeration, so we always played a game where who could chug the most jelly, which is a lot of fun. So there we are, chugging jelly. Dan's clearly the only adult in the group, and we're facing this long lake. And it goes mostly northeast, so with kind of the wind was facing just the right way in this. And Dan had the idea to give the kids this task to see if they would bond. And he said, all right, we have 3 canoes. We have some rope, and that's really where this is going to tie in. We have a tarp. We have your paddles. Whatever you can find in the woods, make a sailboat. Make a sailboat. We've been paddling all morning, all week. If it falls apart, your sailboat, we have to paddle these canoes 15 more miles straight down this lake, not stopping. If we want lunch, we do it on the water. So it better work. I didn't think it was going to work. Dan didn't think it was going to work. It really was just an exercise in getting these kids together. But they were off. They were engineering, they were discussing, they were making plans, reviewing plans, delegating responsibilities. Everyone was working on something. And here's what they did. They took the 3 canoes, laid them out, got some pine saplings and laid them across the gunwales, the opposite direction, so they could lash that all together. They made sort of a square for the tarp and a mast, which they carved out a bit so it could bevel and turn a little bit. They take the tarp and they tied that to the oarlocks with a pulley so they could let it go back and forth. And the knots had to be so tight on this. They put the paddles down so they could be kind of a keelson. And every knot had to be so tight because there's going to be a lot of pressure when the wind kicked up. I just didn't think they could tie the knots tight enough. I didn't think it was a good design. I didn't think it was going to work at all. But we got in, and it was hard to balance the sail lines because the boat's going this way, and it's hard to pull this way. And so Dan was a strong guy, so he got in there, and he was working it. And with his help, it was starting to steer, and I was starting to trust it was working because the ropes were holding, and the people were holding. And the wind was moving us, and faster than any canoe in the history of Canada, we flew 15 miles down the lake. And we had a little celebration that night. It was a blast. It was effective. It was bonding. It might have saved our trip because that poor boy found something that he could do to help. And others found out what he was good at, cutting down trees, slicing trees, carving trees. And when we got our knots tied right and pointed in the wind just right, anything could happen. Number 2, last week, if you were here, you heard about my friend's grandpa, who every time he goes sailing, before you leave the harbor, everyone has to take a swig of rum. Better than jelly, in my experience. So up in New York, they had a sailing race every Tuesday night, and I got on the boat for the first time. I knew 0. Completely lost. It was my first, just like when Jackie, when she walked in here before she was ever coming to church here, she brought me some eggs. She walked in the door and she said, I haven't been in one of these for a while. That's it. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that's how I felt on the sailboat. Is I have no idea what's going on here. So they gave me a crash course. This is a jib, and this is this kind of sail. And this is a line. They don't call them ropes on sailboats. It's a line. So there are all these things to watch out for because this is becoming serious. If we get some weather, you have to pull this line. You have to grind it with the little, I don't know what they're called. If you pull the wrong rope when you're in the middle of a turn, that is serious trouble. If you're making a turn and you don't see when you're making a turn, the boom comes swinging across, I hope you can swim, because that's just going to whack you and knock you right out of the boat. So it looks, when you see a sailboat, it looks so placid, so smooth. When you're on a sailboat, the sails are going everywhere and everyone's jumping one side to the other side, starboard to port to balance, and you're working to reel in the lines and trying not to get seasick, and you get splashed by a rogue wave and you lose your hat, and at some point you wonder, what am I doing on this stupid boat? The captain might be nice, but he doesn't seem to have a clue of what a beginner that I am. They told me a few things, but this is not working the way I expected. We were supposed to be a crew, but I feel like the weak link, and I'm not sure I want to be on this boat for much longer. And then you make a smooth turn. It just goes so right. You watch the wind fill the sails at the right time, and it picks up the boat, and it feels like it was meant to be. You work together on the lines, one pulling, the other pushing. You work together with the wind, turning into the waves, and so the water is actually refreshing, not dangerous when it splashes over the bow. You see the glint of the sun on the horizon. You're surrounded by beauty. And when you push down that initial disorientation, it's almost like the crew has more patience than you knew they had. It's almost like the sailboat itself has grace, and anything can happen. Third sailboat. In Jesus' day on Galilee, they were much simpler than the real sailboats we have today, but much more sturdy than the canoes that the boys put together. Lake Galilee is in many directions, it's in kind of a bowl, a little bit like Barker. So you're in this little bit of a bowl, and the wind can come through and kick down and kick up really fast. So fishing boats, they didn't have complicated sails, and they really relied on oars a lot when the wind kicked up. But they did have some very important ropes on their sailboat. See, fishermen in those days, they worked at night. And in the morning, they would prep the fish for drying and selling. The translation that Cindy used just there said that I think you said they were fishing, but it's not a were as in Jesus walked up and they were actually in the act of fishing. It is they had been fishing at night, and now they were with their nets, and now they were on the shore in the morning. They were drying their fish. Oh, this is almost every fisherman in that day. And what they would be doing as the sun came up is mending their nets. All the time the fishermen mending their nets in the morning. Picture these young men. They worked hard all night. They're tired. They're worn out. Maybe they didn't catch many fish, but they have to mend the nets, because if there are any tears, you don't catch anything next time. And if you don't catch anything next time because those knots aren't sturdy, you aren't going to make your budget. And if you don't make your budget, what happens to the ship? After all that hard work, you still have to mend those ropes. And Jesus said right then, when they're trying to keep the crew together, tired, a little aimless, he says, it's time to do something even harder. It's time to do something even more important. It's time to get our nets ready to welcome people. It's time to get our nets ready to serve people. It's time to work together to get this ship moving in the right direction. Time to enjoy the experience of ropes carrying us somewhere. We're not talking about sailing. We're not talking about ropes. Because when you work toward tying us all together in love, that can change the world one heart at a time. When we welcome folks, when we serve people in need, anything can happen. And so this boat we sit in here, this ship, this congregation, the worldwide body of Christ, the ropes of love are what hold it all together. And sometimes it takes hard work. It doesn't really feel like love to create a policy for children's safety or to do background checks. The session right now is working on a manual of operations. That sounds, yeah. Did everyone see Mary Lou's head just go, oh, gosh? Yeah, it doesn't sound fun. It sounds more like engineering and delegating and planning and reviewing the plans. And paperwork doesn't sound all that great. But ships need those tight knots to hold us together when the winds blow hard. It takes financial savvy, financial courage. It takes property management and simple stuff like emptying a dishwasher and cleaning a toilet. Really spiritual stuff, cleaning a toilet. When we trust in the direction and the destination, when we feel the Spirit blowing us somewhere new and life-giving, somewhere with justice and wonder, somewhere that can change hearts and affect a whole town, those are some of the most important knots that we can make in a community. Once we're moving with God's Spirit, it can be such a struggle still to figure out how to guide the thing. Just as Dan had to jump in and help steer the tarp, we think we have God as a captain. We have Jesus as a first mate. You hired this doofus to be the ship's cook or something, I don't know what. But we have to sail a ship together. We as a crew have to figure out how to work with the winds of change. We have to make decisions about priorities. We have to decide what music inspires, what programs can help us grow, what fellowship opportunities bring us together. What if we start pulling in different directions? What if we're slack on the lines as the boat turns? What about when someone goes overboard? If we trust the lines of love, it's not ever going to be easy, but when we work patiently and together with this love that holds us together, we can do pretty amazing things in a place infused by grace. Sometimes we're not great at integrating new folks, teaching them the stories and the structures of the tradition of this love. Other times we just throw them in the boat and pray they have their own PFD, snug and tight. Sure would be nice if we could find a way that everyone could help keep the boat afloat, while at the same time, everyone could feel the Spirit blowing in their sails. I don't think any church has ever found that balance perfectly, but it's a goal to aim for, that everyone have a place where they can give and a way that they can grow. Other times, our hardest struggle as a church is to mend the net of our love. After all the hard work that we do, mission programs, the worship preparation, the community involvement, after all the hard work, do we spend enough time just mending our relationships? Because if we don't, when we let those tears turn into tears, a lot of the work goes for naught. When the lines of love, on the other hand, are taken care of in fellowship and shared purpose and grace and joy, in walking with each other through the difficulties and forgiveness and accepting forgiveness, if we are a community held together by love, we will have a net that functions as a welcome for new people and a service for those in need. And whether we catch people who come in the door or catch people who fall through the system, whether we bring someone out of the darkness into a loving family, this net of love can change our corner of the world for our neighbors and for ourselves. Because love is what holds this crew together, because love is what holds it all together. Amen.